Support for this program comes from Jazz on the Tube, the internet's largest collection of free streamable classic jazz videos. From Miles Davis to Louis Armstrong, from Thelonious Monk to Duke Ellington. You'll find it all on jazzonthetube.com. Start your free subscription today.
Hi, and welcome to Jazz Talk, a Jazz on the Tube podcast. My name is Ken McCarthy, and this is where we talk with people who are doing important work that supports and illuminates the music we love. The writers, the scholars, the educators, the filmmakers, the producers, and more.
Hey, today we're talking with Kevin Finch, and I have to thank YouTube. They recommended his pretty brand new YouTube channel. I went to it, and I was blown away. And I have done north of 100 jazz interviews myself and listened to hundreds more. And I'm going to say that, Kevin, your interviews with George Benson and Pat Metheny are in the top 10 of all jazz interviews I've ever listened to.
Well, thank you. And that part of the credit to that goes to Robert Montgomery, who's Wes's youngest son, who served as kind of the conversation leader for so many of these interviews, sit-downs with the two you mentioned, as well as people like Russell Malone and Lee Ritenour and lots of other folks.
Well, he did a great job. And I'll tell you why I like those interviews so much. We're really into education, and we're really into covering in a lot of our interviews as much as we can that miraculous transformation that takes place when a young person knows they love music and suddenly they're on track. You know, they've got enough skills to be gigging, and then they discover somebody like Wes and they catch fire. And it turned out in both the case of George Benson and Pat Metheny, Wes had a huge impact on their musical imagination. And it was captured so beautifully in those interviews. For people that want to check out the channel, it's Further Wes Bound.
Correct.
And Wes, the short for Wes, Wes Montgomery, Further Wes.
Right.
And so everybody should definitely check out that channel right away. But the channel is in service of a larger project, which is a documentary called Westbound.
Right.
Tell us how you got inspired to do this, what it's all about.
I lived in Indianapolis for 23 years, and I was a jazz guy in high school and college. I played in high school and college jazz bands, and then more interestingly, a Dixieland group made up of Caterpillar engineering executives and two high school kids, my friend Willie, who's a drummer, and me. And so I played trombone. And so I took a jazz music appreciation class in college from a guy named Rich Richardson, who played in Europe, I believe Germany, in the early 60s with Nat Adderley. Rich was a valve trombone player, and he really knew his stuff. And so I was introduced to Wes Montgomery as a late teenager myself. And then when I arrived in Indianapolis, I said, oh, Wes Montgomery's from here. Wes Montgomery is from Indianapolis? Oh, my gosh. Well, of course, that meant his brothers were from Indianapolis. And then on top of it, Freddie Hubbard. And one of those things, when you're trying to explain this to a non-jazz fan, okay, you remember the song Zanzibar by Billy Joel? The trumpet solo in that is Freddie Hubbard. Who's the only trombone player to ever hang out and play with Bird, with Charlie Parker? Pretty much J.J. Johnson of Indianapolis. And so there was this. So I learned the lore of that a long time ago. And then more recently, as I was wrapping up another project, I thought, I wonder if anybody's actually done a full-blown doc on Wes. And NPR has done a wonderful radio doc years ago with the late Nancy Wilson as host. And it was a wonderful radio program. But in terms of a film documentary, not really. And I was surprised by that. And so then I approached the family. I talked to Robert, and his now late mother was still around then, and talked to her long before we rolled cameras and said, this is something we want to do. And so we got going.
Great, great. I'm glad you bring up Indianapolis. Everybody thinks jazz was born in New Orleans, and a whole lot of jazz certainly came out of New Orleans.
Sure.
And then people give Chicago credit and sometimes Kansas City and New York, of course. But I
Right.
don't think people have any idea the super abundance of talent that came out of Indianapolis, out of Detroit, out of Pittsburgh, out of all these cities.
Washington, D.C.,
Well,
Duke
DC,
Ellington.
sure, sure, LA, Fort Worth.
Mhm.
It's really endless. And I hadn't been aware that so many people came out of Indianapolis. Uh,
Well, it was both. It was two things, and we'll get into this in a future edition of Further Westbound. We've got a lot of material on Indiana Avenue, which was the prime place there for jazz. And it was two things. It was this cradle for all these great artists like Slide Hampton, who not only had a great career as a jazz trombonist, but was taught jazz at Harvard, some little school out east. So not bad way to wrap up your career. As mentioned already, J.J. Johnson, Freddie Hubbard, Wes and his brothers, an extraordinary amount of talent. But the other part is that there were all of these great musicians who came into town. And so that would include, Duke Ellington touring, Ella Fitzgerald, Sarah Vaughan, other great musicians who would make Indianapolis part of the regular tour stop. And so both what was being homegrown and what was being featured were of the highest quality. And that was another thing I learned about. Unfortunately, the difference is that in Kansas City, 18th, 12th and Pine, whatever, Beale Street in Memphis, Bourbon Street in New Orleans, these places still exist and they still have many vestiges of their glory days. Indiana Avenue was pretty much wiped out for urban renewal and that sort of stuff. And that means there's only a couple of existing buildings that still remain from when all those guys were playing. And that's a loss. But the city is trying to recapture some of that, trying to recognize and promote more of how important that was.
Gotcha. I think I first got hip to all this when I lived in San Francisco, and I lived on Fillmore Street.
Mm-hmm.
And bit by bit, it slowly dawned on me that Fillmore Street, well, they called it the Harlem of the West.
Mm-hmm.
And there was no hint of it when I was there. You could have gone through with a microscope and you wouldn't have seen any evidence of all the clubs and all the things that went on. Now the city finally woke up and started to do a few things to commemorate it. But we had a lot of great jazz centers throughout the entire country, and Indianapolis is one of them. Let's talk a little about the Montgomery family. First of all, it's three amazing brothers, not unlike the great Jones brothers of Detroit.
Mm-hmm. Or the Heath brothers too. I was also thinking Tootie and Albert, and the Heath brothers. So
there you go. So what do we know about the Montgomery family? How did these boys turn into such phenomenal musicians?
Well, we get into this pretty extensively at the beginning of the film Westbound.
Good.
And that was, they lived in a family where there was music, but not instrumental music. His parents were singers. Just church choir, that kind of stuff, church singing. They invited a folk group once to come in and sort of rehearse and do kind of a concert, I guess, in their house on the west side of Indianapolis. So there was, that's about it. The parents split up. The three older brothers, including the oldest son who died at about age 19, moved to Columbus, Ohio, with their father, Buddy, the youngest brother, and his sister stayed in Indianapolis with their mother. And not a lot happened for quite a while. Monk gave Wes a little 4-string tenor guitar, not a ukulele, but a 4-string tenor guitar. And Wes played around with it. And in a lot of interviews, he said, yeah, but I really didn't go anywhere with it. I didn't do anything with it. But that was sort of like the very early introduction. Then Monk and Wes come back to Indianapolis. Wes gets married, and almost immediately, I don't know, some party or something, he hears a Charlie Christian record. And it was this aha moment. And he was just instantly absorbed with that. and immersed himself in the recordings. You know, he would pick up the needle, put it down, play it again. And this is where the genius part comes in, because on the public broadcasting distribution of the film Westbound, they needed a subtitle for the listing on all the guide channels and all that kind of stuff. And so I said, the genius of Wes Montgomery. So Westbound, the genius of Wes Montgomery. And that's where the genius came in. I could have listened to J.J. Johnson recordings all my life, and, you know, and without any training, I never could have, you know, attempted to play a horn that well. And Wes just kept listening, and he had a great ear. Okay. And he had that ability to translate from the ear to making his fingers move and that kind of stuff. He got a little bit of help from a local guitarist on some of the fingerings, but the rest of it was him. And at first, all he did was play Charlie Christian solos. He was hired to play gigs, and there were, of course, I'm sure some people going, hey, isn't that Charlie Christian stuff? But most of them just going, oh, that sounds kind of nice. You know, you keep doing that. And then he started to build his confidence and branch out from there. A few years later, Monk, kind of hanging out with his brother, says, I think I could play bass, and teaches himself bass, you know, and becomes the first person to play a Fender electric jazz bass guitar. Really? So he was an innovator of it in his own right. And he also formed the Las Vegas Jazz Society. So he had a great career. He played with all kinds of people, Lionel Hampton and others. And then Buddy picked up piano and then later vibes. And of course, he played for a while with some no-name Miles Davis. You know? So, I mean, these guys had incredible careers, and it started very low-key, pardon the musical pun, and that's how it got going. And they were all basically, if we don't want to use the term self-taught, because Pat Metheny hates that phrase, we'll just say instead informal instruction.
Gotcha.
Okay. And very much self-motivated, that sort of thing.
But they started relatively late in life.
Yes, exactly. I mean, Wes picked up that guitar, a 6-string. He went out and bought a used 6-string electric guitar and a small amplifier. And he was 19.
Wow.
And by his mid-20s, he's touring with Lionel Hampton. And he gets, as you'd see in the film, he gets a solo, you know, because a lot of the big film studios back in the 40s were doing shorts. You know, you come in, you'd see a cartoon, and then you might see some short film before you see the feature film. Yeah. Well, a lot of these shorts were on jazz, different jazz jam sessions, that kind of stuff. And there was one with the Lionel Hampton band, and there's Wes getting a solo. So this is a big horn band, big, you know, 20-some piece jazz orchestra. And in the middle of it, there's this guitarist who's playing with the thumb and playing amazing jazz guitar. And he's only a few years out of having picked up the instrument for the first time.
Incredible. I'm sure you've seen this interview. I can't remember who the interviewer was. It's a black and white. It's from the 50s. And Wes is talking about how he learned various things like his octave playing. Mm-hmm. And he says, yeah, I was trying to do something to tune my guitar, and I thought it sounded kind of nice. And I thought, why don't I do more of that? You know,
we include some of that. That was you mentioned Detroit earlier. That was recorded in Detroit at a local. It was before there was a PBS, but it was a local not-for-profit public television station with a very enthusiastic and knowledgeable jazz host who did the interview, and it was great stuff. And you know, Wes is humble, which everybody knew that part already, but also just revealing that little information about using this technique to tune. And if you have a great ear like he did, then you can't stand anything that's slightly out of tune or anything. Mm-hmm. And so he was always adjusting. He was always conscious of exactly where he was in that regard.
Well, you know, non-guitar players may not know this, but guitars are never in tune. They're a nightmare to keep in tune, no matter who you are.
And that's I think you and Wes would have gotten along because that's what he says all the time. In several interviews, he's talked about how frustrating that is because and the thing is that you want to get technical saxophone is you know, because of it, you're tuning on the cork isn't exactly the greatest thing to keep in tune either, but guitar has its frustrations, and Wes felt them.
I have to wonder about his introduction to music through singing. We did an extended interview with a guy named Vic Hobson, and Hobson points out that Louis Armstrong thought of himself as a singer, got a lot of training in singing in grammar school, believe it or not, was immersed in it, had a little boy band. The four guys went out and sang on street corners. And it might, because the mystery of it, Armstrong is, he's sent to reform school, he's given a bugle, and suddenly he's playing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I wonder if the same thing might not be true. I mean, this is all speculative about Wes Montgomery. All right, maybe he hadn't picked up an instrument until later in life, but he'd been singing. And when you sing, you really have to listen if you're going to be a good singer.
Well, he was certainly around it. I don't know, and we didn't really dig into, that sort of foundational level.
Yeah.
But he was around it as a kid. He was around it in his neighborhoods, first in Columbus, when he was away for a few years, and then back in Indianapolis. But clearly he had the light bulb moment, and that was Charlie Christian.
Gotcha. And this is a kind of from left field, but have you ever heard the name Eddie Durham? Does that ring a bell?
Yes, and actually in some discussions tangentially to Wes.
Okay.
But that's about all I know about the guy.
Well, we stumbled on Eddie Durham through his daughter, and Eddie Durham was one of the pioneers of electric guitar, the technology of it. He invented the wah bar and things like that. And he actually taught Charlie Christian.
Really?
Yeah. So he was another super modest guy. He also, interestingly enough, played trombone very, very, very well. And he was music director for Jimmy Lunsford and Count Basie. And
wow.
He's sort of this strangely unknown guy where when you actually look at all the things he's done, he was kind of one of the most important figures in jazz, but I didn't know about him until I met his daughter, and she started filling me in, and then I verified it. Dan Morgenstern, you probably recognize that name. He's great. He's a massive Eddie Durham fan. So Wes had an interesting career too, in that he made the leap to pop music or pop type music. And how did that go for him? And I know sometimes in the world of jazz purism, people feel you're a sellout if you actually make a living.
That's right. If you issue a bunch of albums that get great reviews and they sell just enough copies to keep the record company interested in you, then you're great. Yeah. The moment you actually start moving a lot of boxes of records, then wait a minute here. And, it's interesting. A lot of Wes's stuff, of course, that was involved big production arrangements and that sort of stuff was with Verve, and especially with the A&M label and under Creed Taylor. And a lot of the string stuff in particular, in 1968, releasing his last couple of albums that, had orchestra arrangements and that sort of thing. 1 year later, you can check my math on this. Pretty sure it was 1 year later, B.B. King releases The Thrill Is Gone, and it's got strings. And The Thrill Is Gone introduced a whole lot of people to blues. And so same kind of thing, I think, with this and jazz is there were a lot of consumers who got comfortable with jazz. And because early on, Wes was playing the subcategory known as hard bop. That was the part he was involved with. And, if they would have gone to a club, they would have really enjoyed his music, but would they have bought the records? Well, then when you frame the records in these lush arrangements, big orchestra involvement, that sort of thing, then suddenly, I'll buy let me see. California Dreamin', that sort of thing. And that's, I like that. And there's a lot of pop music covers on this and some of the other records. And so it was, hey, I'm all right with that. We in the film talk to a lot of people about that, and there's a great deal of passion on this subject from Pat Metheny, from George Benson, and from Wes's nephew, who really has some interesting things to say about this, and kind of pointing out that jazz used to be pop music. You know, why can't it be pop music? Why can't why can't Wes sort of lead another charge and remind people that this is what they used to be on the top of the pops charts, and that sort of thing. So, another great person on the subject is Russell Malone, who's touring, I guess, this summer. Wonderful jazz guitar player himself. And he talks about, was Wes selling out, or was he, and this is Russell's words, cashing in? In other words, was he finally getting some recognition for what he'd been doing and laboring in not obscurity, but certainly not the kind of fame that would later allow him to be on the Herb Albert variety show playing a song with Liza Minnelli, for crying out loud. That's when you're way up there, and that's where he got to go. And so people got more comfortable with jazz because Wes Montgomery made it easy for them to handle it.
Gotcha. And George Benson, interestingly enough, had that experience as well. And then, of course, the great Nat King Cole, who was a smoking hot jazz pianist. There was no better. He broke through to that higher level. It always seems a little mean-spirited. It's like, hey, the guy's making big bucks. Why not just celebrate that? He's
Well, and I think there's another part of this too, which is, for African-American musicians in particular, who weren't always treated well by record companies, that sort of thing. Why can't Wes make some money? Why can't B.B. King make some money? And you mentioned Nat King Cole and that sort of thing. Why does it, why is that something only, they should only labor in a somewhat obscurity? And so I think that the film really gets into this pretty well. It's one of my favorite parts of it is that whole issue.
Oh, good. Now, you had mentioned your time zone for this interview, so I want to respect that. Tell us about the film. Where is it in its development, and how can people support it?
Okay. It premiered on WTIU, the Indiana University station in Bloomington, Indiana, in late February for broadcast. And it is on their website through the pbs.org streaming platform. So you can find the film right now. If you go to pbs.org, Westbound, some combination of that, Googling, you'll find the film. It's not on YouTube, but it is through the pbs.org streaming platform.
Gotcha.
Distribution in that world is a little different. It's not like a big splash. It's a gradual build. So later this month, it gets distributed for broadcast to the rest of Wes's home state of Indiana. That's stations from Evansville to Indianapolis to South Bend, Fort Wayne, that sort of thing. Then it will be distributed nationally through American Public Television, either the fourth quarter of this year or the first quarter of next year. We're still waiting to hear which is going to be. So that's the broadcast component, but the web stream component is already there. You can already watch the entire film on pbs.org with Westbound.
Great. Do you think there'll ever be any maybe performances at festivals, screenings at festivals, jazz festivals? Or is that I know it's a complex world of distribution. It's not so simple.
It's not so much the distribution there that's complex. That gets complicated is music rights, which have exploded in cost in the last 4 years.
Oh, really?
Following the likes of major musicians such as Bob Dylan, Bruce Springsteen, and others, Stevie Nicks, selling their entire catalogs to major music corporations, and that's really brought up the cost. So that's one factor. But if a streaming service, a national streaming service got interested and we could work out the price related to all that kind of stuff, that would be my next hope for where it would go. Gotcha.
Yeah, I've known a lot. I had a friend that made a really good film on James Booker, the great pianist from New Orleans, the Maharaj, I forget what the name of it. And she got hit by the music rights thing. I think she was able to distribute it through festivals, but that was the cap before she had to write a huge check. And this was pre price explosion.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we are in an inflationary era, aren't we?
Yes, we are indeed. So
Okay.
I'm very happy that, that it's in the PBS family, and that it's on the pbs.org streaming platform, and will continue to grow on that, especially as their broadcast sisters start picking it up. Because, what often happens is that some people catch some of it, most of it, oh, I missed it, whatever, and then they go online to see if it exists there, and it does.
That's great. So Kevin, thank you so much for this time and for making this film. It's unbelievable that it took this long for someone to realize that Wes deserved a full treatment.
I agree. I think that's, when people were asking me when I was doing some fundraising for the film and everything, I said it was sort of like ending an injustice, that the injustice that this man had not been getting his due, his recognition for his contributions to American music and to jazz in particular.
That's great. Well, we've been talking with Kevin Finch, and the film is Westbound, and lo and behold, we can actually see it on PBS. Tell us one more time about how to access it via PBS.
So you can get it several ways. Just Google Wes, W-E-S, Bound, second word, B-O-U-N-D. And then you can add, if you want to speed up your search, just add WTIU. That's the station in Bloomington. That's what's called the presenting station in public TV land. And so you can do it that way, or just hit westboundpbs.org. Any combination of those Google keywords will get you to the film, and which has the usual stuff about who helped support it and all that at the beginning. And it's the standard PBS length, which is a little over 56 minutes.
Great. And then there's the YouTube channel, which I endorse mightily, called Further West Bound. Kevin, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed the podcast. If you did, please share it. That's how we grow. And remember to subscribe to JazzOnTheTube.com, the internet's largest collection of free, streamable, classic jazz videos.